Hello, welcome to LookUpStrata's weekly webinar presentation. My name is Will Marquand. I'll be your host this week in place of Nikki Jovovich, who is on holiday. This week we will be speaking to Michael Ferrier from EYEON, who is a property inspections expert, and he's going to be discussing all matters regarding Strata Inspections and Strata Records. Hello, Michael. How are you doing today?
Hi, Will. Really good. Thank you.
Okay,
Great
good, thanks. And unfortunately, we have to start today with an apology because this is the second time we've started this podcast, isn't it, Michael?
It is indeed.
Yeah. What I need to advise people at the beginning of this session is that the information in the session is based around the New South Wales legislation. And so we're really only talking about New South Wales issues, although I think that realistically that every strata in the nation has to keep body corporate records, and most of the issues that you're touching on will probably be reflected across the various states. I'd also like to advise that today's session, we're not providing legal advice and that you should not consider any of the information that's provided in this session as such. If you do need the assistance of a lawyer, well, please go and speak to one. They're very helpful people, and I'm sure they'll give you the correct information that you need. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're joined today by Michael Ferrier from EYEON, and he is a professional property inspector. He has turned his business from what was a cottage industry into a professional level service. And EYEON offer high quality reports and customer support to property buyers and sellers. Michael himself has been in the business for over 35 years, dealing across government policy, financial services, banking, franchising, small businesses, and of course property. You're also a keen golfer and rugby nut. Okay, so Michael, you're in the business of solving problems for people looking to purchase into body corporate properties, and you're going to give us a little presentation, and we'll talk about that as we go along. So I'll hand over to you next.
Thanks, Will. Righto, let me just start things off here by sharing my screen. So let's talk about Strata Records. Something that's common to every strata scheme, and as you said, it's even though this presentation is about New South Wales, this issue applies to all strata schemes wherever they are in Australia. So what are Strata Records? Well, obviously they're all of the information that is generated around the operation and management of the building. There's a lot more documentation than many people probably think. Now, some of the stuff that's most obvious to people is financial information. You know, everybody who's an owner pays levies, and the financial information lets people know where those levies are spent, and how any money that's saved is invested. And when I say saved, I'm really talking about capital works funds here, which are savings funds that buildings have to make sure that they can upkeep capital items or replace, upgrade capital items. Building insurances are obviously vitally important to people, and this is a cost that's become a much higher cost in recent years for buildings. And those insurances need to be updated all the time to reflect changes in costs. So people need to get replacement cost estimates, or building valuations, as they're sometimes called. There are meetings obviously held annually, AGMs, but other meetings in between AGMs, whether they're strata committee meetings or whether they're other general meetings. And those are where the decisions that the owners take about things affecting the building. That all needs to be recorded. Same with correspondence, which is mostly email these days. And that can be a lot of correspondence that needs to be kept. And then look, issues arise in buildings. They can be simple issues or they can be complex legal issues. We see a lot of, in newer buildings, a defects process. So some buildings don't have many issues with defects, but many buildings do. And there's a process that goes through and a lot of documentation related to that. It can sometimes mean that the reports that we prepare run to over 1,000 pages. And often a big proportion of that is defects reports, inspection reports that are done by defects specialists to make sure that the warranties that builders and developers provide are fulfilled. Bylaws are an important area too, because they set out the rules that the owners need to play by in living in their building. And it's a community that you're buying into. So it's very important that you understand that. And because you're living in a community, it's important that people do things in the interests of the community. And that's what the bylaws in many ways are there to look at. So all of these records form a really important part of that ongoing community. Now, usually these records are kept by a strata management business, particularly schemes of any size are almost always, I'm going to say, hire a strata manager to look after their affairs. Now, strata managers do a lot of things. Keeping records is one of those things, and it's an important part of what they do. One thing I will stress is that I think it's important that buildings form a good partnership with their strata manager. And I think it's an undervalued element that owners sometimes see it as a necessary evil, a cost they have to incur. But if you approach it and look at it from another way, it's a really important way to keep the building running smoothly, to make sure you're on top of all of your issues, and to make sure that the building is looking forward so that you've got a plan for the future. Strata managers can help with all those things. You just need to make sure that you nurture that relationship and make sure that they've got enough budget to enable them to fulfill everything that you'd like them to do. In smaller schemes, we often see records being managed by the owners themselves. And usually one of the owners will take on this role to keep the records. And that can work fine. I mean, there are many buildings that have kept their own records for many, many years. When we inspect records of self-managed businesses, we often, well, almost always, we find that the records aren't of the same quality as you would get when they're managed by a strata manager. And to an extent, that's to be expected, but it can raise a lot of questions. So if one of those, if you've got a 2-lot scheme, a 2-apartment building, and one of those is being sold, the person who's looking to buy that is then presented with a situation of sometimes handwritten minutes. A bank account really is, there's not much more in terms of financial records than bank statements. And so they start to question, well, actually, what am I buying into here? And is this a bigger job than I thought it was? So something to bear in mind for those self-managed buildings. Whether you're self-managed or whether you use a strata manager, the records that are generated belong to the owners. And it's a really important thing for owners to understand, so they don't become disconnected from the records, because they sometimes think, oh, this is just something that the strata manager does. I don't need to worry about this. Fine, the strata manager can look after it for you, but they are your records, and you want to make sure that you're confident that those records are being kept properly. Now, as I said before, strata is a community, and so operating the building, maintaining the building is a joint responsibility. Okay, so like you jointly pay your levies every quarter in your building, you want to make sure that it's a joint responsibility to make sure all the other things that are happening in the building are also done well over time. And as you'll see a bit later on, I think there's a connection between the type of records a building keeps and the type of building it is overall. So the strata records themselves really represent a sort of a shared history of the building, because the ownership in the building will change over time. People will sell their apartments, new owners will come in. So it's important that there's a continuity with the records. And this is something I also think that is overlooked. A lot of owners don't want to be heavily involved in their building. They may not necessarily want to get involved in the strata committee, and that's fine. But what they then find is if something goes wrong or there's an issue that they want to understand better, all of a sudden they find that the information isn't as good as they'd hoped it might be. And again, owners and their partnership with the strata manager here can be quite important, so that you get less surprises if you're a passive owner and all of a sudden you need to understand an important issue. Our experience is that strata records, or the quality of them, is really variable. Some buildings are great, but many buildings don't have great records. And usually the owners don't know that the records are poor, because for various reasons, owners don't need to look at the records very often. And so they're unaware of the state of the records. Most owners just turn up to the AGM And that's perhaps the only involvement they have with the building and the records in any particular year, other than getting their quarterly levy statements. There are lots of reasons, and I've listed half a dozen or so reasons here why records can be poor, and we'll look at those individually in some detail. Some of those reasons can easily be fixed by owners and by strata managers. And so let's have a look at some of those. Oh, the other thing I'll say here before we look at them is that if a building has poor records, then what we see, and we're looking at the records of thousands of buildings each year, is what we often see is that poor records often suggest that there may be other issues going on in the building here, whether they're issues between owners or where there's issues about the way that some owners want to run the building and so on, that can suggest that there could be some problems here. Now, as I've said in the slide here on the side, it's a generalization. So please just take it as that. There'll be many good buildings that perhaps don't keep the best records, but there's an opportunity for those buildings to be even better by improving their record keeping. Now, perhaps the biggest issue we see is missing records. You know, we search records and we can't find things that we should readily be able to find. Now, there's a few reasons for that. They can be just misfiled. Sometimes a strata manager may have records that they've got aside for a particular purpose. Occasionally, there'll be issues with access to records because of legal professional privilege, because of an ongoing legal issue. But perhaps the biggest issue why there are missing records is where there's been a transfer of records between strata managers. So you often get situations where a building decides to change their strata manager for a variety of reasons. It could be an individual issue, it could be a cost issue, it could be a relationship. Somebody's got a relationship with a different manager. Whatever the reason is, they change the manager. And when that happens, the records need to be transferred from the old manager to the new manager. And that process is not good. And as you see in the slide there, my suggestion is that it's bad in about 90% of cases. Now, that's just not our view. That is a pretty accepted view from a variety of strata managers that we've talked to. They acknowledge it's an issue. And in fact, talking to Strata Communities Australia, which is the peak body for strata managers, they also acknowledge it's an issue. One of the reasons it's an issue is that the various systems that strata managers use to keep the records often don't communicate with each other. So one manager operates system A, the new manager operates system B. They can't talk to each other. So what happens is the records get transferred as a document dump. And depending how that's delivered, often we see hundreds of documents that have no file names. They're not classified. They're not in any sort of date order and so on. So it becomes very difficult to find things. The new strata manager will look for essential stuff because they know what they need to focus on in the short term. But often other documents that perhaps we need because we're looking 3 to 5 years back when we're doing a strata report, we can't find. So it's a big issue. Something that owners, again, are not aware of, but something that they need to consider if you're thinking about changing strata managers, be on top of this issue up front. And a bit of a plug for us, we can help you with this because we do provide a service to owners where we would go in and essentially take a download of all those documents, prepare a report for the owners so they have a version of the records in case records get lost in the transfer process. I'm hoping this issue will get better over time, and I'm told it is a focus, a recognised issue in the industry that they want to improve on. But at the moment, it causes issues for us in a lot of buildings. Yeah, you agree with that, Will?
Yeah, it's a permanent issue of problems between, whenever we take on a new building. Sometimes the transfer is relatively straightforward, as you say. If we use the same back-end software as the other company we're taking over a building from, it can go relatively smoothly and most of the records stay intact. if the other company is using a different software, has a different software to our system, you know, then it can be pretty patchy what we get through, and we do our best to try to fill in those patches, but it's an imprecise process. And unfortunately, it's the same when we pass over buildings to other schemes as well.
Yeah.
The same software as us, great. If not, then I'm sure, you know, then they might have the same problems. I don't think there's an easy solution, or I don't think there's really a recognized solution out there to that at the moment.
No. And it seems to me that when you're budgeting to take on a new building, that because you're trying to sharpen your pencil as much as you can when you're putting a proposal to a building, and that they don't realize that this is an issue, that there's often there's no budget provided for, you know, the potential, because you don't know what the shape of the records will be, do you, until the transfer happens.
You don't know until you get them. And so a lot of contracts do have a sort of building setup fee built into them. That fee might just be a few $100s. Often that fee gets waived as part of the take-on process anyway. It's part of the sort of give and take of acquiring new business. Even when that fee does exist, the reality is it probably doesn't even come close to covering the amount of work that's really required to establish a new building correctly. And as you say, what happens is that schemes get going in the short term, and then managers look to sort of patch things together over the long term, but there's quite a lot of gaps in between.
Yeah. So look, for owners, this is it's an opportunity here to recognize this issue, and so to communicate. I think, you know, perhaps part of the reason you're looking to change managers is a communications issue. I don't know. But if you're talking to potential new managers, you need to make sure that this issue is on the table, and that, you know, you need to let them know what sort of records you want to have for your building, and to give them the opportunity to make sure that they can provide those records to you going forward. Now, the other thing that we see a lot is that the records perhaps don't tell us enough. As I said before, the minutes of meetings are often where all the decisions are taken, or they are where the decisions are taken. But often the information in the minutes is very brief. It just tells you what the decision was without giving you any context, explanation as to why the decision was taken, or the discussion around the decision. And I think those minutes could be much improved if there was a little bit of commentary in there, just to give a bit of context around some decisions. A lot of the decisions that are taken in annual general meetings are year-to-year decisions, whether they're around insurance or reappointing the strata manager, or other compliance-related things. That's not so important. But where there are more complex issues or legal issues and so on, it's valuable to understand a little bit more context for those. And each of these things, and not just this issue, but some of the other issues we'll talk about, each of these issues helps a potential new owner, and it's the context that we're looking at records usually, helps that potential new owner feel more confident about what's happening in the building. And I think that's a really important point to make. The other side of this is that sometimes strata committee members are a little bit protective, possessive about the records. And where an owner wants to understand about a particular issue or wants to see some documents, they get told, no, you can only, you know, turn up at the AGM and have your say then. There's no reason for that. Owners are entitled to see the records at any time. That's certainly the case in New South Wales, and as far as I know, it's the case elsewhere in Australia as well. And so there should be more transparency about this between owners. So again, this is an easy issue to fix. And as I said before, most owners won't want to see the records very often, but when they do, don't make it hard. So records that are not up to date. This also comes up regularly. Can be that minutes of meetings are not being finalised very quickly. We had a situation just recently with a buyer that got very frustrated. There were some ongoing defects issues in a building they were looking to buy into, and there'd been a meeting making a couple of important decisions around that, and there was no minutes available, and they couldn't get any clarity on what the decisions were taken because nobody wanted to say anything until the minutes were finalised. In the end, that person walked away from that building because they felt like they were hiding something. They were hoping to get the property sold before the minutes. That's what they felt. Now, I don't think that was the actual situation. It was just a very slow process to do it, and perhaps slower than it needed to be. We also see situations where owners are deferring decisions, pushing decisions down the line. And they can be simple things like getting your capital works fund forecast updated, making sure that your fire safety compliance is up to date, getting a regular update on your building valuation to make sure that your insurance for your building is for the right amount, and so on. Getting the financials finalised. We often see balance sheets that don't balance because the previous year accounts haven't been finalised, and that can drag on for months and months in some cases. So all of these things affect the quality of the records to a degree. And you sometimes see a building where year after year we see we need to update the capital work, defeated. We need to do this, defeated. Now, the owners in this case are perhaps not wanting to spend money on updated reports, but this has an ongoing effect, a growing effect on the building, and perhaps on the quality of the building, the quality of its maintenance and upkeep, and so on. Sometimes we say to people, we obviously haven't been to the building, we just search the records. We often say to people, how does the building look when you've been there to look at it? And where the records are poor, we often hear them say, well, it perhaps looks a little tired, it perhaps needs a little bit of an update. And that gels with what we see in the records. They're behind on compliance things. They're behind on projects that they perhaps need to do. So it's a really important issue, and it's something that owners should be more aware of. Usually it's a financial thing. They're trying to avoid spending money or delay spending money. This next issue is not something that comes up very often, but we have seen it in occasions, and this is where there are complex issues, perhaps negative issues going on. Perhaps there are structural issues in the building, defect issues, and we see situations where it appears that some information has been left out of the records, or that the records perhaps don't properly reflect the issues that are being experienced in the building. Now, we have had situations where we've become aware that the minutes that are in the records perhaps only reflect one perspective on an issue, that some owners or the strata manager more likely have not felt comfortable about what's been recorded in the minutes. And they've either decided that they don't want their letterhead on those minutes, or they take their name out of the minutes. They don't want to be associated with the minutes because the owners are trying to reflect something that perhaps isn't reality. So, as I say, it doesn't come up very often, but it's really important that from a record keeping perspective, that you don't give a false impression about the building. Because I think in a lot of cases, it comes to bite people when a property may be on the market. As I said before, if owners feel like the records are opaque, that there's unexplained issues in the building, then it's a big red flag for people. And sometimes it can be a big enough red flag for people that they decide to look at another property and not go ahead with the one they're looking at. So again, this is really a lot of this is on owners to make sure that you face up to issues and provide solutions. And one of the things I'll talk about in a minute is what we see in what I'd regard as better buildings. So as I said before, poor records can sort of be an indicator of sort of more general issues in a building. And one thing we do see with the better run buildings is that they have better records. You know, they're up to date with all their compliance issues. They have an active strata committee, and that strata committee will provide good communication with the other owners and probably have a good relationship with their strata manager as well. In many cases, you see an annual report from a chairman of the strata committee or the strata committee generally that explains to owners, this is what's happened in the last year. This is what we're hoping to do in the next couple of years. This is what this means to us from a financial perspective. You know, these are the things we're trying to do for the building. and so on. And you can tell that there's a good community in that building and that the owners take pride in the building. And where bad things happen, you know, they may have a problem with a lift, or they may have water leaks, or whatever the issue is, they're on top of it. They communicate what's happening, how they're looking to get it fixed, and so on. And what we see when an owner is looking to sell a unit in that building is that the buyers can understand what's going on. They can understand what it means to them, and that makes them feel a lot better. So understanding the issue is a good thing. The fact that there's an issue, sure, that can be a potential issue, but once people can understand the context and what it means to them, it allows them to face that and make an informed decision about it. On the other hand, where the documents aren't great, it can also suggest there's a less healthy community, and that maybe owners aren't really engaged. Maybe the finances aren't up to date. You know, they haven't updated their capital works fund forecast for 10 years. We see this commonly. How do you know that the levies are appropriate for the building if you haven't had anybody look at it for a long period of time? And that they try to push the bad news down the road because they don't want to face it, and perhaps, again, it's often a financial consideration. But usually that issue is not going to get better, and it's just going to mean more costs later on. So again, facing these issues is important. That's all I really wanted to say on these things. There's a lot of issues. Will, I'm sure there's some questions that have come to mind for you.
What I wanted to know, first of all, so in your business, a prospective buyer engages you to do a search of the books and records. You go along and you have a look at the records and you provide a report back to that prospective buyer.
That's right.
In terms of your report, how do you interpret the information that you are seeing? Do you kind of give like a thumbs up or a thumbs down, or a traffic light system of, yeah, looks like a good property, or looks like a bad one, or do you keep it more neutral?
Look, really good question. These are not subjective reports. So they are a summary of the records. Most of the report is a summary of the information, whether it's financial information or insurance information. We do have a section in the report that we call notable matters. So these are the things that we think are important for people to understand. And so we would then set out what we see as the situation in the building, or what it looks like that situation could be. So I guess we provide a bit of an insight into that, but we're not saying we don't recommend this building. No, nothing like that at all. It's not for us to say. We haven't been to the building, so we don't have that insight. All we're trying to help people is understand what the records are telling us.
Okay, so the information you provide is more factual, and then sort of how that information gets used is still much more dependent on the individual's knowledge of perhaps the buying industry, the property market, that kind of thing. They still have to put their own interpretation on it.
They do. One thing I would say is that I think perhaps one of the most important elements of our service is the follow-up support we can provide, because a lot of people who pick up a report, open up a report, and as I said, these reports can be anywhere from 80 pages to 1,000 pages. It can be daunting. There's a massive amount of information and documents in our report, and many people who are looking to buy into an apartment building really don't understand strata that well, and perhaps never lived in a strata scheme before. Well, even if they have, perhaps they've never really had to be that engaged. And so it's confusing for them. Now, we can often spend 10 or 15 minutes on the phone and explain to them what things mean, and it gives them a lot more confidence and understanding about what they're doing. So I think that's a really important part of the service. Sometimes people get a report, they're just ticking a box. Okay, somebody said I should get this report or look at this report. Yeah, I've ticked that box. Don't look at it like that. Look at it as an opportunity to learn something. And if you don't understand it, there aren't any silly questions to ask. Ring up and say, look, I just don't understand this. Can you explain it to me? And we can do that for you. And we can help you really understand what you're buying into.
Yeah, okay. Because my guess is a lot of people might not even really, they might get a report, but they might not know what questions to ask as a follow-up
Yeah. So if somebody, we do occasionally get people who are brave enough, if that's the right term, to ring up and say, look, I've got the report, but I don't really understand it. Can you walk me through it? Right. And so we'll do that. We'll take them through. Financial situation is something that people are often focused on. So they've got X dollars in their capital works fund. Is that good or bad? People say, was that good or bad? I mean, and we say, look, it's difficult to know, but the thing to compare it against is somebody who's an expert's come in and done a forecast and made recommendations about what those levies should be each quarter, and then how much money you need to have at the end of each year over a period of time. So what we can say is this is what they've recommended, and this is where they are at the moment. Now, I mentioned during my presentation about situations where people haven't upgraded their forecasts for a long time. Now, then we would say to them, look, it's harder to know because the recommendations are so old that lots of things will have happened in the building since then. That means that those forecasts mean a lot less. So my personal view is that these things should be updated all the time, because the more you update it, the more accurate they're going to be, because they can take in more live data each time they do it.
What do you find that is being done well? My guess is most financial records are at least transparent. Whether you agree if there's enough money going into the building or not, that's a different question, but the record should be fairly clear. I'm expecting that most minute books are fairly up to date. Is that presumably the case? I would probably also expect that most compliance things like pool certificates or fire safety certificates and things are probably up to date. Is that?
That's all true. And in New South Wales, fire safety, which is managed at the local council level, many, perhaps most councils have had a big project on fire safety. So many buildings have had to go through upgrades to bring their fire safety stuff up to standard. They need to get an annual fire safety certificate. And yes, we would expect to see that certificate for pretty much all buildings. Just going back to the ones that are self-managed, often those really small buildings of a couple of apartments or perhaps four, perhaps don't need a fire safety certificate because they don't have any fire safety equipment in the building, a bit like a house. They're almost like a house in that sense.
Okay. So if those areas are kind of being done well, where are the deficiencies? What are you finding that's all kind of always problematic or often causing you a problem?
So while the minutes generally up to date, what's in the minutes could be better in a lot of cases. A little bit more detail. Where there are issues in the building, it would be great for there to be a little bit more commentary in the minutes about the decisions that have been taken around that. Sometimes we'll see a separate document that gives you some understanding about that, and that's good. But I think sometimes a bit more detail would be great. So I think that's an issue. Missing records, as I mentioned, is a problem that is frustrating. I know it's frustrating for strata managers too. We sometimes have situations where we have better records than the strata manager does, because sometimes we inspect the same building regularly. So we may have inspected that building half a dozen times over the last 4 years, and we know we've got records from 4 years ago that the strata manager can't find anymore. Now that's really not good enough. So that's an issue. I think that's a really important issue. The other thing too is that there is a fair bit of variability. And when I say that, this is often on the owners more than the strata manager, is that they're not really up to date with forecasting, for capital expenditure in the building. That's probably an area that I do think a lot of buildings could be better at. They're supposed to get an update at least every 5 years, but we regularly see capital works forecasts that are 10 years old. And there's been nothing. You can see in the minutes they've talked about it every year, but nothing happens. So I do think that's an area that a lot of buildings could be better at. And that often does then reflect when we talk to potential buyers. They were supposed to paint, according to the last forecast, they were supposed to have repainted the building, but it hasn't happened. And so the building's starting to look a little tired. So those issues each year, deferring this thing each year, has a build-up effect.
It's interesting what you're saying. I mean, in terms of minutes, just from sort of a manager perspective,
Yeah.
I would say that record keeping or minutes keeping is as much of an art as it is a science. And there's often quite a bit of toing and froing between managers and committees about what is and isn't included in the minutes. Obviously, you have to have the factual record of what the decisions actually are, but in terms of like note keeping and recording that, that can often be areas of like dispute between various members of a strata ownership group. And then I think perhaps for that reason, managers often keep the information more limited. You know, they keep it to what can be explicitly stated as a fact rather than providing any interpretation. So then there are probably good reasons why you don't get longer minutes, but it's interesting to know that if that would affect, you know, sales prices moving forward, if that's something that owners would want as in terms of the records of their properties.
I certainly acknowledge that the strata manager is often hamstrung a little bit here, because essentially these are the decisions of the owners. And so, you know, the strata manager is really acting as an agent for those owners. But I think people are worried about putting some information in minutes, but I think they're worried unnecessarily. And I think that sometimes the lack of information causes more problems than it would if they were just a bit more transparent with their information. That's my sense of it. Whether it affects prices, impossible to say. Over time, will people start to look at these issues a bit more in terms of how they classify buildings? I think there's a possibility that data will become a more important element in this over time, and that we don't really rate apartment buildings, you know, at the moment. We perhaps look at them as some have got more features than others, you know, but we don't look at it in terms of how's the building run? Is this a well-run building or not? But there's no reason why that couldn't be a consideration.
From your perspective then, you're kind of looking at it from the view of the records. What do you see as being well-run and what do you see as badly run? What are your warning signs?
Let's talk about the well-run ones to start with. And I think the thing that stands out to us when we're looking at the records is that there's great transparency and good communication. So when we look at the AGM and see that with the minutes is an annual summary presented by the Strata Committee, those owners that are probably perhaps most engaged in the building, which tells the owners what's happened, tells them about any issues and what their proposals are to solve those issues. You can just feel that there's a good vibe about that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, where you're getting the opposite sort of vibe from the records is that decisions are deferred. They don't really want to spend money that they should be spending. You just get the sense that this is a building that will perhaps gradually fall behind. So, you know, as I said, it's more of a sense than particular items, and we're making an assessment based only on the records here without actually seeing the building. But as I said, when we talk to buyers about what they've seen when they've been at the building, there's often a correlation between the good vibe and the bad vibe that you get from the records. And I think that's a really important thing. Yeah.
And do you find buyers are taking your information in and really making the purchasing decision, perhaps based on the information you provide, or is it more of like you know, well, we're supposed to do this report, but we look at the price and we look at the building and we just make our decision on that basis rather than on the information that's in the records?
Probably the people that have that sort of approach are not calling us and asking questions. So I guess a lot of what I'm saying is based around those people that we engage with, who we talk to about the report. And often the ones that call us are calling us about buildings that have got a bit more going on or a bit more complicated than some buildings that are relatively simple.
Yeah.
Those that are ticking a box are probably not going to ask any questions. They've got the report. They may not even have read it. They perhaps decided they're going to buy the property anyway before they even got the report, and they've just ticked that box and moved on. People who are more focused on doing their due diligence and wanting to understand what it is they're getting into are asking those questions. And they're the ones, I guess, that's where probably my comments come from, is the sort of experience we have with customers. We do get people, and I'm sure you've had this with buildings you manage. We get people contact us after they've bought a building, bought an apartment in a building, and they say, "What the hell is going on? You know, what have I bought into here?" Because it's not what they expected, at all, and they haven't done their due diligence before they purchased, and now found, oh, this is not what I hoped for.
It's a very common conversation in our office. Some new purchasers to the building calls us up and they say, "Can I do this? Can I do that? No, this is mine." And we say, "Sorry,
No.
you can't do that." "No, it's not." And they go, "What do you mean?" And I say, "Well, it's all in the records. Did you check them out before you purchased?" And people are like, "No." It's like, well, okay, but it's very difficult for us to help you now. You purchased it, caveat emptor, it's buyer beware. And often this is over quite big things, particularly parking spaces. There's a lot of confusion over how many parking spaces people tend to own. There's a lot of confusion about what is and isn't their responsibility as an owner to maintain.
Yes.
And when once the purchase is done, it's done. And people get quite emotional, often sometimes angry with us, because we're not really able to say to them, "Well, yeah, you can just go ahead and do it," or "Yes, you own 2 parking spaces," when in fact they might only own 1, or something like that. We can only provide the factual information, but it causes a lot of heartache for people, doesn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, you just, when you were talking there, one recent example comes to mind of a situation where people had bought a high-end apartment, and a very expensive apartment, only to find that the wooden flooring that had been installed throughout the apartment had not been approved. The bylaws said you can't have wooden flooring. And they then faced with the prospect of perhaps having to rip the whole lot out because it wasn't installed, correctly, or wasn't allowed to be installed. And in a way that reflects badly on the building. How can somebody go through that sort of project, getting all this flooring, and nobody's noticed, nobody cared, until their neighbours below complained about the noise from the floor, which is obviously part of the reason why often wooden floors are not allowed. And that's just one, of a number of examples we have. And remember, we had somebody contact us recently. Had bought into a commercial strata scheme and found that there were massive disputes going on between owners, and they only found out about this after they'd bought into it, because they hadn't done any due diligence.
Yeah. So if you don't do it, the costs could be in the tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars in some instances.
Absolutely. Absolutely right.
Okay, so what about things like legal privilege? So if a body corporate's dealing with an issue, it's maybe going through lawyers, are they obliged to share that information with potential purchasers?
Well, I'm not a lawyer on this stuff. I mean, obviously there will be some situations where there'll be some legal limitations on what they can and can't share. What we regularly, the types of legal disputes that we most commonly see are between builders and developers and the owners, relating to defects. The other type that we sometimes see are disputes between perhaps the strata manager and owners, or between owners themselves. And often these go to NCAT, as it is in New South Wales, or state-based tribunals to get sorted out. We don't often see situations, we don't often encounter that many situations where we're flatly told we can't see documents. But But occasionally there'll be documents missing, and when we ask the question, they say, "Oh, yeah, look, there's a current issue going on, and we need to speak to the lawyers first," or whatever, to find out. I don't know what your experience with that is, just from the other side, from a strata management perspective.
Yeah, I'd say most of the time the information would be available, but every now and then there's something that's sensitive, and it does make sense that it's just not freely available to all parties because it might prejudice one party's case or another.
Yeah.
If you're a purchaser buying into one of those lots, it probably does make the decision much harder because you're taking a chance on something that is not evident to you and is not.
Yeah. And this guy, what goes to the point I was making earlier about when people can understand what's happening and they can see the pathway for that, it makes it a lot easier for them to make a decision. It's where there's unknowns, whether they're financial unknowns or disruption unknowns or legal unknowns, as in this case, that makes it harder.
And one of the things you were saying was owners themselves probably don't really know if their records are up to date or not. How can they check this? They might not always feel like going to the office to do a full search of the books and records, so they might have the time and energy to do that.
No. Yeah.
Are there any easy ways that they can check and get a test the pulse of the management company that's running things for them?
Yeah, well, as I said, look, they are entitled to inspect the records, but as you say, that there's an effort, and perhaps they're not familiar with what to look for or where to look for it. Businesses like ours can help them with this. Often we do get approached by owners saying, "Look, I want you to inspect the records because I'm looking for stuff, and they're telling me it's not there, but it should be there." Usually that's related to some sort of dispute that's going on in the building. For an owner that just wants to really check, are our records up to date? Probably getting a third party like us is the easiest way to do it. It'll cost you, about $330 for us to go in and search the records and give you a report, which is perhaps not a big cost. If you want to get that peace of mind and then perhaps look at ways that you could improve the records.
Yeah.
And for a lot of people, some owners want to lift the standard of the building or the standard of the community, and perhaps getting a snapshot of how the building's been run recently is valuable.
Yeah, I'd probably say that most, certainly committee members, should get a good feeling over time as to whether the manager's up to date, because they'll be having questions and asking for information all the time. And if your manager's able to provide that with you fairly quickly and easily, that's probably a good sign that they've got it ready and on hand. And if it's taking a long time to get information out of the manager, or if they're constantly saying, "Oh, we don't seem to be able to find that," or not being really able to provide with the information you see, maybe that's like a bit of a red flag that you should watch out for. Yeah.
I was on a strata committee in a building where I own an apartment, and we asked the strata manager if they could do a monthly report on where things were up to. We had a few insurance issues and a couple of other things like that, and we wanted to make sure the things were kept moving. A couple of maintenance issues that kept recurring, and that worked quite well. So we got a monthly update on how things were moving, and if there was a delay, why there was a delay. And that really helped. That communication between the strata manager and the committee in that case really did help to make sure we kept on top of things.
You touched a little bit on self-managed schemes. So these are schemes that don't have a body corporate manager or strata manager acting on their behalf. My experience of, when our company's taken over self-managed schemes and we've started managing, the records have been, mostly non-existent, frankly. It's the easiest way to put it. Maybe I get a few bank statements, perhaps a certificate of currency for the insurance, and that's about it. And often the reason why those schemes have come to start working with the professional managers, because they know that they're struggling to provide things like insurance information or certificates of disclosure certificates when required. What would you say to these kind of schemes that are managing by themselves? Are you finding that they're keeping up?
No, well, I think as I said during the presentation, when we do inspect the records of self-managed schemes, we do find the records are generally in pretty bad shape, and there's not a lot of them. And sometimes we'll get calls from people who are looking to buy in and say, "Well, this is a terrible report. I mean, you really haven't told me much here. And we have to explain to them, look, all the report is a summary of the records, and there aren't many records.
Yeah.
And that's the issue you should be thinking about here, is that it's very hard for us to know what's been going on in the building, because they're not keeping any record of what's happening,
Yeah.
or not much record of what's happening. So it is something that, if you're buying into a self-managed building, that you need to be aware of. And then you get the situation where the person who's kept these records wants to sell their apartment, or they don't want to do it anymore. And then they've all of a sudden, this is perhaps the reason why they then get a strata manager to take over, is that nobody else wants to do it. And but yes, look, generally we don't have high expectations when we do self-managed. I mean, there are exceptions, clearly. Yeah. There are some people who are really diligent and do a good job. But yeah, the majority of self-managed records are not great.
Yeah, I think that's my experience. A lot of self-managed schemes, the day-to-day management of it, organizing contractors, speaking to other owners and things like that, that's maybe quite easy for an individual to manage, but the records keeping part of it, which is a significant part of the operation of the scheme, it's part of your legal obligations, and if you don't keep up-to-date records, you could find all kinds of problems as a result. I find that they really struggle with that aspect, and it's something for those self-managed people out there to really consider, because you're taking on board a lot of risk without necessarily even knowing it or knowing how to correct that.
That's right. And if you think about houses for a moment, that most people who own a house don't have very good records about all the things that have happened in their house over time. And then if you have a duplex or a very small apartment building, I think people approach it more like how a house owner does, rather than thinking about it like a community. Yeah.
In Queensland, they're talking about changing the way that body corporate records are kept and then presented, in terms of what information is presented to individual buyers. That kind of conversation might be, spread out across the country over time. What kind of information do you think should be absolutely mandatory within disclosure?
So you're talking about vendor disclosure here that would go in the contract for sale, I'm guessing, right?
Yeah, I think that really touches on what you do as well, presumably, because people are coming to you to verify what the vendors are saying.
Well, there are two aspects to this. So in some states, say Victoria, for example, there's a very high reliance on the vendor disclosure information. So there's not a high incidence of people doing strata searches as a separate process. The information that's in that vendor disclosure, and I'm not sure how far Queensland are going with this, is really around the last AGM, the current accounts, perhaps current insurance information, current levies, and that's about it. So, and sometimes that information could be 3 months old when the buyer gets it. Now, I personally don't think that that's nearly good enough for buyers to make a decision on what's going on in the building. But in Victoria, for example, that's long been the case, that people just do that. So
what would you like to see? What do you think they should have?
Well, if you're going to have a compulsory disclosure, I think it needs to be much more detailed than that. But I don't think that's going to happen. Like all of these things, there'll be a compromise, because clearly, if and normally this work is done by the strata manager, if they had to prepare the sort of report that we do, it would be a big burden on them, and there'd have to be a higher cost associated with it. The other side of it, and this is something I mentioned before, is that where that information is all presented as part of the contract, there's really nobody to ask questions about what does this all mean to me? Because surprisingly, a lot of people, conveyancers, don't necessarily understand the ins and outs of strata either. And so while it's great to have hundreds of pages of information, if it doesn't mean anything to the person reading it, where's the value? So I'm a bit I wouldn't like it to all become compulsory disclosure, because I think there's a really valuable element here of getting support that is overlooked in that disclosure stuff. In New South Wales, they've started a thing called Hub, which is a central registry of limited information about strata buildings. And it emanated from COVID, where emergency contact information, for example, wasn't available. And so they've decided to set up a centralised repository for all of this information about buildings. Now, that may get expanded over time so that more strata records have to be provided to this central repository each year. And that could be a way for less records to go missing over time. Depends how far they take that. Yeah.
You mentioned previously perhaps having something like a rating systems for buildings. Do you think that would be a good idea if we had 5-star, 4-star, same as we have?
Yes, I mean, it's subjective. Yeah. It's a subjective thing, because you have to have parameters on which you make the ratings. But I can't see why not. It'd be great for people who live in a building who feel like their building is one of the higher rated buildings. And it could be aspirational for owners who want to lift the standard of their building, to say, what do I need to do to make it a higher rated building? Because I think that's a perspective that just doesn't exist at the moment, is that people see apartment buildings as they base it around what type of building it is, in terms of features or size or what have you, rather than what sort of a place is it to live in, and how well kept is it, and all the rest of it. So
yeah. And at the moment the information's available is still a bit short of that, isn't it? People, and that's what we've been discussing, people can access the information, but the interpretation of the information is still quite a difficult thing to
and I guess the reason that I feel able to sort of make some comments about this stuff is because we look at the records for so many buildings, we see a great variety of them. And then we can sort of pick up trends from that as well. We collect a huge amount of data about these apartment buildings. And so I guess the comments I'm making are perhaps, come from, that experience over time.
Okay, and just as a sort of last question, where do we think this is going to go in the future? Are we going to be taken over by AI, and AI will start filing everything for us, and we'll enter a brave new world, or are we just going to carry on muddling through? Do you think? What do you think might happen in the next few years?
Look, understanding AI is something that I have on my to-do list. So I'm certainly no expert on that. I was listening to a podcast just yesterday where I didn't know this, but AI has been around for 10 years. But now they've created an interface for us to use it, and all of a sudden it's exploded. Whether it can help with things like this, I don't know yet, but I do think that the scope of AI is going to grow very quickly, and so it's quite possible that AI can help in the records keeping process, or make it a little easier. And if it can, that'd be a great thing, because one of the things about these records is a lot of them, it's a process, and perhaps that's where AI is great. It can make the process easier.
Yeah. There's a great deal of processing that goes on. People aren't really aware of how many records there are to keep, and how many records we can keep as managers. And so I think if we can get to a stage where there's improved technology, it doesn't necessarily have to be AI, but that looks like it's kind of where the future may be going, but at least improved technology to help file and correctly place where these records are kept, then that may be beneficial.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and again, it's good for owners to be aware of this, aware that the burden of record keeping that rests mostly with strata managers. It's good for them to understand that, because I think it's often forgotten. Yeah.
All right, terrific. Thanks very much for your time today, Michael. Very
much
appreciated.
Great chatting with you, and we'll talk again.
Okay, thanks for everyone who's tuned into this session, this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Have a good day.
Cheers, everybody.
If you gained value from this video, please hit like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. If you're looking for information about parking, strata insurance, defects and more, head over to lookupstrata.com.au or sign up to our free weekly newsletter via the link in the description box below.